This potato and leek soup, provided by the Hero's Cookbook, is an easy, hearty, and cost-efficient recipe. It's perfect if you're trying to cook for a crowd, and this is how you make it. The recipe calls for 3 leeks, 2 slices of thick-cut bacon, 2 pounds of russet potatoes, a cup of cream, and about 4 cups of low-sodium broth, as well as an herb. The recipe calls for specifically thyme, but you could probably use rosemary, even oregano. So, first things first, let's get all of our ingredients ready. Potatoes! They'll be making up the bulk of the recipe. If you're using russets, you'll want to peel them. You might be able to get away with leaving the skins on gold or red potatoes, but boiled russet skins have both the taste and the texture of wet cardboard, so best to peel them off. I'd already chopped off the ends of these leeks, as well as peeled off the outside layer. I'm just going to slice them into thin rounds up until the leeks get fairly dark green. Excuse the awkward angle, I just wanted you to see what I'm doing. You just want somewhat thin pieces. Don't worry about getting it perfect, it'll all be blended up in the end. I'll mostly be using the white part of the leek. It's up to you where you want to stop cutting. I'll be stopping about here. Unlike with spring onions, the dark green parts of leeks are very fibrous and won't break down easily, so I'm just going to toss them. But if you want, you can make stock out of them. I sometimes do. The recipe insists on only using the lighter parts of the leek. I imagine that's to do with color, but more on that later. Next up, celery. Same deal, just chop them up into tiny pieces. I'll be adding them to the same bowl as the leeks, as they'll go into the pot together. Alright, back to our peeled potatoes. Chop them however you want, thin slices, huge chunks. It doesn't really matter, as long as you're consistent. At the very least, I'll be chopping them in half, just to make sure I don't have any rotten ones. It'd be a real pity if a rotten one got in there. And finally, we have our bacon. The recipe calls for 2 slices of thick bacon. This is as thick as I could find, so I'm going to use 4 instead. The bacon fat is what we're really going for here, so we need to render out as much of it as possible. That's why I'm slicing them up ahead of time. Although if you wanted to, you could keep the recipe vegan and just use 3 tablespoons of oil instead. If ever there was a recipe to bake your bacon with, this would be it. Not only would you be able to better control the size of your cooked bacon slices, but you'd really be able to render out all the fat. But then again, this dirties less dishes, so pick your poison. For this recipe, I'll be using my 7.5 quart Dutch oven. This thing is absolutely amazing for anything you'd want to cook. And if you don't own one, I'd highly recommend it. But you can make this recipe in any old pot. Where were we? Right, the bacon. The bacon goes in. The pot is still cold at this stage. Remember that the bacon is a means to an end, and that end is fat. We want to render out as much fat as possible, and that means building up the heat to give the bacon as much chance to release its oils as possible. I'm also putting in a bit of olive oil to give the bacon a head start, but that's just me. You don't have to. The book says to cook at medium heat. I imagine they were using a gas stovetop. If you're using induction or an electric stove like I am, you'll want to have your heat on low. Low and slow we go. Move the bacon around, make sure all the pieces are making contact with the pot. You'll want to stir occasionally to get the uncooked parts of the bacon touching the pan. Keep doing that until eventually, with patience, you'll end up with this. Ta-da! You could go darker than this, but I reckon we've got about 90% of the fat out at this stage. Any further and you risk burning the oil and the fond we've built up, which will leave you with a nasty, bitter taste. Alright. Now we can just remove the bacon to a plate with a paper towel on it. Move it off to the side, we'll be using it as a topping later. And this is what we waited so long for. You see all this bacon grease we've built up? Yeah, this is going to give our porridge an awesome taste. In our leeks and celery go. We're just going to cook them until they've softened considerably. Stirring occasionally. Make sure you use your spoon to rub off the fond you've built up when you're cooking the bacon. The vegetable should release enough water to make this fairly easy. Otherwise, you can try adding a bit of your stock ahead of time. Once you're satisfied with how translucent they are, it's time we add our potatoes. In they go, as well as 4 cups of our low sodium broth, although I think you could probably get away with full sodium. You'll want all the potatoes at least partially submerged. I didn't have that, so I went with an extra cup, 5 cups for me. Oh, the recipe also says to add the thyme at this point. You can if you want, but I prefer the fresher taste when you add it at the end. Up to you. Like I said, rosemary would probably go well as well. Now we just cover and bring to a boil until the potatoes are reasonably tender. Maybe 10 minutes, depends on the size of your potato. Just check with a fork or a knife. Mine were good about at this point, so in the time goes, the book says to use 2 tablespoons of fresh thyme. I don't know what kind of psychopath measures fresh herbs, but I'm not gonna do that. I'm just eyeballing it. Once sufficiently soft, the book says to use an immersion blender, something every respectable dwarven kitchen has, to blend the soup until smooth. I don't have an immersion blender, and you probably don't either, so I'm just going to use my food processor instead. If you don't have a food processor either, you could use a potato masher. You just won't get as smooth a consistency. I'll blend the soup in batches. Ooh, a little bit of spillage there. No big deal. Just blend so all your soup is smooth and return it to the pot. At this point, you should have a soup that looks kinda like baby barf. I imagine that's why the recipe calls for a cup of cream at this point. You can't convince me otherwise. It honestly made very little difference in how the soup tasted, but it does wonders for the color. If you don't care about that, then you could probably skip it. Vegans, you can always add coconut cream instead. Just stir, stir, stir until it's homogeneous. Make sure to taste for seasoning. I needed a lot of salt, some pepper, and that's it. We're done. I topped my bowl with some sharp cheddar and our bacon. I added some smoked paprika too for the thumbnail. But you could top this with anything. Tortilla chips, eggs, meat. Heck, you could probably even put in maple syrup to make it sweet. Honest opinion, it was a pretty great bite of food. The porridge makes for a great base to add things to. It's pretty versatile and super filling. I ate the leftovers the next morning with a sunny side up egg and some leftover bacon. And I swear, it tasted even better than the night before. Although, I'd recommend adding something acidic, maybe vinegar or lemon juice. You'd want to avoid balsamic vinegar, unless, again, you don't care about the color. I can definitely see myself making it again. This is exactly what I imagine a tavern serving its guests late at night, and probably the next morning too. Super rustic.